Well, thanks, everybody. I hope you can hear well enough. Just to set the stage, I was the Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation between 2003 until January of 2011, just to kind of give you a sense of things. This topic of transportation related to the whole issue of climate change could probably chew up a whole semester's worth of activity and discussion. So clearly I'm going to be talking about some experience I've had and, well, citing a few other things, but believe me, we're just scratching the surface. Stephanie gave you enough information to, I guess, have you believe that things have been going on here, that things that we ought to really worry about. Here is CO2 concentrations measured in Hawaii over a long period of time, so something clearly is going on. You've seen some of these kinds of charts already. Transportation really is a big factor in the issue of, or a big contributor in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. You've also seen these kind of charts, which if you, and this was a 2006 piece of information, light duty and heavy duty vehicles on the road were over 80% of the transportation arena. So no matter what statistic you're looking at, obviously transportation has an effect. And here's a long history of global temperature information from the National Academy of Sciences. Again, you may have seen this in some earlier classes. So something clearly is going on, and that ought to make us all interested. And you folks have experienced something recent, and I can only tell you that a number of my colleagues in other state DOTs have now been finding unusual weather events that have really affected the way they think and operate their systems. This obviously is very recent, and oh, by the way, if you've got an extra bag of nails and a couple of hammers and you want to help Doug Foy out, this actually is his house, so there you go. This was a time when I was a secretary in Pennsylvania. This is Interstate 78, and not a real fun time for me, I can tell you. We ended up closing 200 miles of road, and stranded vehicles for up to 20 hours. So stuff is real, and something's going on that's different than perhaps we've seen. Other challenges that folks who have responsibility for transportation infrastructure face are these kinds of things, and you've seen all the pictures of Tropical Storm Sandy, and so you know, it's hard not to believe that there's something really going on. I want to talk about three things primarily: a little bit of experience that I've had in Pennsylvania, talk a little bit about the subject of trying to adapt if you're someone in charge of a transportation system, or fortify the system, and last but not least, much of what Stephanie talked about, which gets into changing habits and people struggling. I'm going to particularly zero in on some work going on in California that as we speak, and it really is interesting. My experience in Pennsylvania, first of all, just to acquaint you with Pennsylvania, the State Department of Transportation is responsible for 40,000 miles out of a system of roughly 120,000. The 40,000 miles carries about 75% of the traffic, so it's a larger volume road and so on. Lots of transit going on in Pennsylvania. Every single one of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania has some kind of public transportation. Big city stuff like Boston and Philadelphia, slightly less so in Pittsburgh, and much less in some of the small communities. But transit is a factor. This was also sort of some recent history when I first walked into the job. Over the period of 1990 to the year 2000, there was a relatively small percentage of population growth, but a huge increase in developed land. And clearly something going on about out-migration and so forth. And not surprising, at that same time, there was the commensurate increase in VMT. And Stephanie also told you that as you have continued beyond the period of this chart, which is more to today, there's been a slight drop. But there's an argument about whether that's going to rise again or not. But significantly, this was the environment that I found myself in. Not surprising that the folks on the staff that I inherited were very solidly behind the way you deal with that is you add capacity. So we were struggling like the dickens to do this kind of stuff. And when it came to be my first time in the barrel to take a look at what was going on from the whole program standpoint, I also found while we were building a bunch of roads, we had a system, at least state-owned system, in terms of its roads and bridges that frankly was in peril. So when it came the first time that I got involved working with my staff about updating the 4-year capital program, we got serious. And we identified 26 projects out of a list of about 900 that had a price tag of $5 billion, of which simply continuing to work on those things, because these were projects that were widening projects and freeway extensions and so on, probably we're going to spend at least $500 to $800 million just on design alone. And when I asked my staff, when are we going to be able to actually cut the ribbon on these projects, there was no answer because they were projected way beyond the period we could even see. And yet we still had this problem of a backlog of fix-it problems. And so we started on a process where basically I insisted that we really pay attention because we were absolutely losing control of our system in terms of just repair. And over the years that I was there, we went from spending 25% of our money on new capacity to slightly under 4% when I left. And it had a heck of an effect. We went from 6,000 structurally deficient bridges owned by the state to, when I left in 2011, we're around 5,200, and that trend has continued past my time at the department. The number of miles of poor roads, we had 40,000 miles of roads. When I walked in the door, there was about 11,000 were in poor shape. When I walked out, it was 7,000. So we made some progress. That's a good thing. But what about all the capacity problems? Because that didn't mean the congestion was going away. That just meant that I was focusing on something else. So we had to go into thinking a little bit differently. And so I started talking to my staff about land use and growth and understanding that kind of stuff, and they really were pretty sure I was from Mars, absolutely from Mars, no question about it. But we stuck a little bit to our guns, so I started working with my senior staff first, and we started talking about, do we understand when in some of the developing areas, as development occurs, typically what we've done in the past is expand the road system to meet the demand until you get to this kind of a situation where mostly there's not much you can do to widen because you don't have enough money, God doesn't have enough money to buy the right-of-way to widen the next step. We started looking at these kind of relationships where typically if the yellow line represents some kind of a growth in traffic, eventually at some point, the traffic outstripped the available capacity. So in the past, what we did was we added capacity. We made a forecast of the 20-year projection, and we would widen the road to take care of it for a certain period of time. But what really happened was this. So we produced the capacity, but what happened is there was some induced demand, and in fact, the traffic grew faster than we thought, and so we would widen again, and then finally you get the situation that you saw on the previous slide where there's no place to go. There's no right-of-way that you can afford anymore. And not surprising, we talked about these kind of things within my staff. Again, now you gotta understand, I'm a little bit of an outlier in this group because I wasn't born and raised in the department, so I'm a guy coming in, and they're still really not quite sure if I'm really wrapped tight, but we talked about these kind of things, and we really talked about sort of a vicious circle where we were providing more capacity. People tend to be moving out, at least in many of the communities, suburban communities in Pennsylvania. That meant produce more congestion, and we're back where we started from. So we started talking about other relationships. We talked about where we were widening and traffic was growing, and these, this represents sort of the peaking characteristics of morning and evening commuter and so on. When you get to facilities that are 4 and then 6 lanes wide, there's less of that capacity that's being used all day long. If you're back down in the 2-lane, you can see much part of that lower part of this graph is being used a lot. But when you finally get to the extra 2 lanes, when you add on top of 2 to get to 6, it's being used in the peak period, but there's lots of periods where it's not. So the question is, it's also a question of smart use of the resources is one of the issues. So we started asking questions instead of the normal conventional approach of, building more pavement and doing those kind of things when we had more cars. We started asking these kind of questions. I have to tell you, typical highway department engineering talent is just not into all these things. They are beginning to, and clearly we were on a track to really start to learn about this. But it was really an evolutionary process. And I'll have to also admit to you that it took a while to kind of bumble around. There was no clear path for, at least in my experience, but we ended up talking an awful lot about different kinds of relationships. Here's one where if you look at this example of a land use pattern, you've got a development. If the wide gray road on the bottom of this little slide represents kind of an arterial road, and the rest of it is sort of neighborhoods, and there's a school, and there's houses and apartments. What happens when you're trying to get from place to place, even when this development, you've got to go back. The trips come out of the neighborhoods onto the arterial, then go back into another location with a shopping or school and so on. Versus the old kind of conventional neighborhood where, not surprising, a lot of the trips stay within those areas. So we started talking about land configuration. Well, typical state DOTs are not in the land business. And so we got to find another group of people to talk to eventually. But when you get to these stages, the question is, do you have a happy place? Is this a place that you really want to be, or mostly you want to get through and go someplace else? It was, at least there's a sort of a nucleus of folks I can tell you that I worked with at the department in PennDOT that finally said, we really have a problem here. We can't afford the conventional kind of approaches to doing transportation, which means we're going to have to learn a set of new skills, and we're not quite sure what the track is. But at the same time, we were exploring things independently. The governor's office in Pennsylvania, the governor that when I was in Pennsylvania was Governor Rendell. A number of his staff was, in fact, stealing stuff. I come to find out later from Doug when he was involved in the Massachusetts under Governor Romney. He was thinking about understanding the relationships of transportation and economic development and housing and on and on. Our folks developed a series of principles that were important about redeveloping first, perhaps, thinking about concentrating development, restoring and enhancing the environment, and somehow where do the transportation folks fit into that? It was pretty clear to us, at least in the department, after really thinking through our particular setting, was that there is something to the business of linking land use and transportation, and perhaps we should be on a journey to figure it out. Somewhere along the line, it occurred to me that we better widen our little circle of friends. And so, in fact, what we did in Pennsylvania was we gathered a whole lot of folks together representing these kinds of disciplines, whether they're municipal officials, whether they're state agencies, developers, consultants, on and on and on, folks in the transit business, and we better just work together in a different way. And we said we've got to figure out how to do things differently. I had been preaching certain philosophies, but I have to tell you, if I had a mirror and looked behind me, there ain't nobody behind me but me talking up front. And so, frankly, bringing this kind of a group together was really, really helpful. It allowed the folks who were my engineers to listen to developers, as well as transit advocates, as well as community officials, saying, maybe there's a different way of approaching our business. And so when what we did ultimately was helped to finance creation of something called the Smart Transportation Design Guidebook. And what that did is it basically said, you don't have to use the old federal highway standard to solve every single one of your problems, because every highway engineer always wants to go to the extreme end. I want to touch this road one time, I want to widen it to this wide, so I don't have to come back. Well, guess what? You don't have enough money to do that, and oh, by the way, I'm spending all your money to fix stuff, so you better think differently. And so what this did is the guidebook got us into the business of saying, well, maybe we ought to size the road to better fit the community. And so we spent a lot of time finally having our folks really thinking through and listening to the community fathers and mothers saying, this is what I want to have my community be. And oh, by the way, help me now use more flexible design standards to do that. So that was one of the things we did. Here's an example of a project, one of the big projects that we couldn't afford anymore. We said, it was my job to meet with a number of elected officials in the community and tell them, guess what, the project you've been working on for 15 years ain't no more, which is really a lovely experience. You never want to do that. Because they said, all right, well, you know, I can tell you that I ended up meeting with area members of the House and Senate. It turned out there were 5 members of the House and 2 members of the Senate in this 8-mile stretch of a design of a roadway in suburban Philadelphia area. And I told them the bad news. Sorry, you know, the thing that we've been working on and we did design. Oh, by the way, we spent $80 million already. We spent $40 million buying a 300-foot right-of-way for 8 miles. We spent another $40 million on design, and my job was to tell them, you can't have it. And all I can tell you is after about 4 months of back and forth, they finally saw that I was serious, and they couldn't figure out a way to get around it. But I said to them this, I said, if you're willing to work with me, we will design we're going to use that right away, but I got to find something at a far less scale. And it was an interesting process. It also turned out that there was 11 communities involved, 11 municipalities. 8 of them were right on the top of the right of way, or right, their jurisdiction was within the right of way, and there were some folks on the end and some sides that were involved. And I said, I will not do this unless we have also unanimous approval by all 11 municipalities. We spent lots of time in the field talking to folks. I can tell you what we ended up with. We ended up with, out of the 8 miles, we ended up with a 4-lane section for 20% of the 8 miles and a 2-lane roadway for the remaining 80% of the roadway. We designed it, instead of being an 8-lane freeway with 3 interchanges, it became a parkway kind of facility that had, surprisingly enough, instead of a 65-mile-an-hour design speed, it had a 45-mile-an-hour design speed, which meant, among other things, I could also shed $40 million worth of noise walls. It wouldn't be necessary anymore because the noise from tires is much less at 40 miles an hour or so than 65. Somehow it hung together. We got the 11 committees to say yes. We did the groundbreaking, and this is what it looks like. It was opened up last year, and unfortunately I missed the groundbreaking. So here it is with its 8-mile also long pedestrian bike facility, and now the folks in the community have decided this is really an important asset to them. It's not the 8-mile long freeway, and it's going to run into some issues. One of the things we asked our communities to do is think about your continuing subdivision plans, and can you somehow scale some of that back to fit this so that the capacity we did provide is going to last a little longer. So I'm not sure that's the perfect solution. I'm not sure we would have ended up with this if we had started out 20 years ago, but it seemed like it made sense. Clearly it will have a lot less carbon footprint over time, but only if the community also hangs together and protects that investment. So I don't know what it's going to be, and we'll walk back perhaps in 20 years and see what happens. Another thing we did to try to get communities to experiment with different approaches to some small amount of funds, we set up something called the Community Transportation Initiative. We wanted to advance what we thought were smart transportation ideas about, you know, trying to have a community produce some kind of, using certain transportation money, but to try to enhance the community. We put $60 million on the table and invited proposals. We got a tremendous amount of applications for our little 60 million bucks. But here's a couple of examples of the kind of things we got. There's a small community in Altoona, Pennsylvania. It's a small little area. One of the things was they wanted to do a 2.5-mile trail to connect the campus to downtown. Another little place east of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, called Carlisle. They wanted to change their downtown to be much more walkable. And we said, okay, that's a good one to finance. It's relatively small. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, this is the kind of what Bethlehem, Pennsylvania looks like. So we're trying to give examples to people of different kind of community settings where you might produce more walking and biking in a friendlier kind of environment, but still that's the location of a state road where normally we would probably obliterate the community with a typical widening project. But it was an incredible learning experience for our folks, and they then became advocates of those kinds of programs because they were interested in protecting the system. So we ended up with a strong fix-it-first kind of a program, but yet our folks all of a sudden were willing to shake hands with the community and talk about how can I change the way I usually design a right-of-way or a roadway now to fit better and end up with a better result. So our folks ended up thinking about this. I have to tell you one thing. I was never allowed to really talk about that. Part of why we're doing this because of climate change and issues, because I have a whole group of contractors who want to just scalp you to death because they're all about big iron. They want to build the biggest, baddest road that's known to mankind. And so what I said to them, no, it's not about climate change. We're building communities. That's a much nicer term. Also, the other thing to tell them was, I can tell you that one experience we had because they were out advocating for yet another big freeway was, you know what? We were spending on average between 20 and 25% of the total cost of a project on design work if it was a big freeway. If it's a rehabilitation of a bridge or a roadway, it's probably about 8%. Guess where the rest of that money goes? It goes back into the contractor's pocket because we can then do that much more fix-it work, and so there's actually more work. I tried to sell that, and they thought I was still a nut, but that's okay. They ended up actually getting more money out of our program than they were previously. Let me mention quickly the subject of adaptation and fortification. This is out of a recent article from Mayor Bloomberg as a result of Sandy. The notion is, he said, well, we're not going to abandon the waterfront, but we're also going to figure out how to try to protect that location as well. And the whole question about adaptation has been a huge topic among something called the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, which is a group that represents all of the state DOTs around the country. In fact, there's a guy named Mike Meyer. Mike was a graduate of MIT, and he spent a long time as a director of the Georgia Institute of Technology. He spent a lot of time thinking about this and working with this group called AASHTO. Here's the kind of things that they're dealing with. No great surprise. Sea level rises and storm surge has really made a huge challenge for all of these kinds of issues, whether it's airports, whether it's Logan Airport, which is sitting right on the water, roads, rail lines, and tunnels, and so on. The big downpours is also producing disruption if you're a person who has to operate and maintain a roadway system or other parts of our transportation system. The increasing temperature has really meant has had a huge impact. There was a plane stuck on a tarmac because the asphalt was that hot. And maybe you've seen some of those pictures where the plane actually got stuck sitting on a tarmac. Bizarre stuff. Really surprising. I know there's been some of my friends in the Midwest who have had some unusual temperature swings have found their pavement buckling, simply buckling because, in the case of many of the concrete roads, just because of the heat. All these things have had a huge impact, whether it's changing and producing more flooding, or whether it's in fact producing more drought. And you've seen even some of that in recent times when they're concerned about whether there's going to be shipping on the Mississippi. simply because of drought. These are some of the projections that Dr. Mike Meyer was making a year or so ago. If you look at the last state, I guess you guys know about that, in the most recent storm. But these swings are becoming, unfortunately, so frequent that there's a whole set of activities going on in the world of managing transportation systems now just to deal with extreme weather. Whereas before it was one of those once every 15-year occurrences. It seems that that's just not the case anymore. So what you see in terms of what state DOTs are doing about this, they're doing a bunch of things simply to kind of hold back. But holding back Mother Nature is really a tough challenge. Because you can spend a tremendous amount of money. I think out of the $60 million that was been awarded to the New York area, I think about billion. Of the 60 billion, I think 5 billion is going to be put into protecting the subway system, as an example. Huge expense to deal with this kind of stuff. Another element is that DOTs are doing, they're asking themselves, well, what should I do from a design life standpoint? Should I raise every bridge? If I'm going to do a 100-year flood now, how high does a bridge have to be? Bridge construction is really expensive. Well, how should I change my construction practices? Should I now anticipate some major storms? And what do I do if you're trying to build, if you're a contractor trying to bid on a project, well, how do you bid that? That's not so easy anymore. And then there's a whole business about dealing with these storms and trying to figure out really what is the best way of managing. I remember there's a woman named Nuria Fernandez. Nuria is the Chief Operating Officer for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York, and she was telling me an interesting little snippet. She said in the middle of the Hurricane Sandy issue, it was 10 o'clock at night, she said, and we had to do a whole bunch of stuff dealing with electrical power, because we wanted to shut off a whole bunch of stuff. She said, one of those weird things. She said, we didn't have the telephone number of the CEO of Con Edison. So just one of those dumb things that we're all changing the way we understand emergency preparedness now. It's just a very different thought process when you have the intensity of some of the storms we've got. So, let me quick switch to mitigation, and then we can close this out. I want to talk a little bit about, first, some things going on at Carnegie Mellon University under the technology side. And you've seen some of this stuff going on in Boston, I'm sure. In Pittsburgh, we said in downtown Pittsburgh, about 30% of the traffic in downtown Pittsburgh is looking for a place to park. So if we can simply have an application that tells people where the available spaces are, and if we can get enough use out of it, we can probably make a difference. Well, that was one of the things that one of our folks did. Another thing they did was in Pittsburgh, again, we're using that as our guinea pig site. Pittsburgh does not have so-called automated vehicle location system on the bus, which means we can't produce real-time traffic information on our bus system. So our folks said, well, perhaps we can get around that. If we produce an application for a smartphone, and the application they chose was tiramisu, which means pick me up in Italian, there you go. But they produced an application that said, well, we'll put the background bus schedule on our little application. So wherever you are, you hit a button, you can find out what your bus stop is, and if you hit hit one of these little red pins, you get the screen on the right, which tells you here's the bus route. So the 28X, anything in gray means you just missed that bus, but here's the next one's coming up. And if you punch another button, if we can get folks to punch another button, once they get on the bus, voila, we've got real-time traffic information, because now their little iPhone or whatever, their Android, is now the GPS unit that in fact reports transportation information, and we can now turn that into real time. We're doing that for a couple reasons. We want to make that transit system as useful as it can, and obviously attract more people to use it, to hopefully have them find a reason now to leave their car home. So we shall see how that goes. Another little piece of work going on is strangely enough, out of our Robotics Institute. They choose this little neighborhood in Pittsburgh that had 9 traffic signalized intersections, and they use their robotic machine learning and algorithm experience to change the way those signals operate, and have produced much more efficiency. If you look at the very bottom line, travel time was improved by almost 26%. The wait time by a whopping 40%, and oh, by the way, reduction in emissions by a little over 20%. We are now going to expand our little 9 intersection test to another 32 intersections to get a far more robust test to see what we have out of it. So we'll see. You may have heard this term and maybe not. If you bought a car recently, you've seen the ads where you back up and all of a sudden you get an indication, so the car either stops automatically by itself or gives you a signal. If all cars finally have a communication device, then at some point the whole system is now connected. And the vehicles know where each other is, and you can do very interesting things. In fact, maybe you don't even need traffic signals anymore. If every single car knows where every other car is, and you've got a built-in set of applications, potentially the vehicles can now assign each other, or assign their own rights of way. And you don't have to spend all the energy in traffic signals, and you can probably have a far more efficient system. Stephanie mentioned the Google vehicles that are running autonomously by themselves. Carnegie Mellon has been in the robotics business for a long time. And in fact, it was the winner in 2007 of a particular challenge. We beat MIT, by the way. But who's bragging? But the car that won that challenge was this Rube Goldberg-looking thing in the top left part of the screen. Well, all I can tell you is in the next 60 days, we're going to be testing on public streets the vehicle in the lower picture, which now has all of the stuff, all the gadgets, all the LiDAR and radar and other sensors buried entirely within the car, and it becomes now much more looking like a real average car. I'm not sure where this is all taking us, but this car would have the ability. What we plan on doing is doing a couple test drives from one location to about another 20 miles out to the Pittsburgh airport and back, and we'll see what that experience is. The Google vehicle has been running hundreds of thousands of miles autonomously, although they have certain characteristics that are different than the vehicle you see in the bottom here. This one really has everything embedded inside, and we're working as part of our General Motors lab. So we'll see what that means, but it has potentially another step up toward efficient operation. The question is, how can we capture the efficiency of that operation both from a community standpoint and from a climate standpoint? Let me switch topics slightly, but still under the category of mitigation. You can probably change the way people travel depending on what kind of pricing you use. And some folks are doing it, some are not. There's discussion in California about potentially using pricing to change the way I-80 operates in the Berkeley area. Doug mentioned this recent article in the Globe that talked about the kind of things that Stephanie talked about, which was how much time people in Boston are spending in congestion and so on. And this little graphic, if you could now look closely at what the road network is, you'd see obviously Interstate 95 and 93 and 90 mostly crowded around those darker areas where you have higher amounts of congestion. The article said if you could change 1% of people's habits, you could probably change significantly what this pattern looks like. 1%. I mean, it's really not much. The question is, what can you do about it? Would pricing mean anything? Some of you may have heard the Stockholm experience that happened in the early to mid-2000s period, where there's a cordon around the downtown area of Stockholm. There are 18 entry points into Stockholm, and they were basically, a system was set up so that by reading your license plate, you would automatically be charged a fee for entering into the Stockholm area during the peak periods of the day. In fact, here's I think this is the current pricing strategy. So between 6:30 and 7:30 in the morning, it's roughly $1.50 if you cross the cordon. It goes up to about $3 in the peak of the peak, and then goes back down to $1.50 in the middle of the day, and then eventually becomes free either after 6 o'clock at night or before 6:30. So the question is, so what does that mean? It has produced a bunch of revenue, and the city has invested in significantly increased bicycle facilities and transit facilities as part of the same program. In fact, you see this little circle, they built some additional long commuting bike facilities, as well as the ones that are kind of interesting in the downtown. They've actually got little brass bicycle emblems in the downtown street system. As I mentioned, they also sunk more money into transit service and some of the amenities of providing people better information about schedules, better signage, and so on. Here are the results that that have been gained in Stockholm. Big reduction in traffic in downtown Stockholm. Big reduction in carbon dioxide. Huge increase in transit usage. Public acceptance, my understanding is it was just teetering on being rejected and completely out of hand before it was implemented. It was only for the force of some of the city fathers and mothers that they were able to even get it in. But now, after the thing has now been in place, the survey of people, what they think about it, is hugely supportive and saying, don't you dare take this up. It is so much nicer in downtown. And one surprise to me was the increase in retail sales. There's something going on there that's a pretty nice piece of information that maybe we ought to be thinking about. They had a bike rental program in Stockholm, and as you know, you've got your own in Boston. In fact, as of 2011, probably these numbers are probably out of date. There's 165 programs worldwide that were someone spent the time to count. 15,000 bikes in Paris. The winner at the time this count was made was in China, over 60,000 in Hangzhou. And so these things have really made a difference for short trips, for connecting people to transit, from the end of their transit trip to another neighborhood. Paris, I was told by a presentation made by the mayor of Paris back in 2008 or so, that they had seen a 20+% reduction in greenhouse gas after they had instituted their bike program, but they also, I have to also say, it was coupled also with some additional transit roadways within town and bike facilities as well. I promised to tell you a little bit about California, and then I'll end my discussion. But California is, I got this information from a friend of mine, a guy named Steve Heminger. He's the executive director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in San Francisco area, which is the metropolitan planning organization for that region. Specifically, California is under the ironclad rules of Assembly Bill 32, which require certain things to happen. It established the nation's first requirement to achieve certain greenhouse gas emissions, namely that by 2020 they will be at 1990 levels of emissions, and that even greater reductions by 2050. The Air Resources Board in California adopted these numbers. Again, you've seen some of these kind of charts. What's interesting is in California, I think Steph mentioned that in Massachusetts the number is 36 or so percent. California, it's 41% of all of the greenhouse gases contributed by transportation versus a world number of 14%. Kind of interesting. These are the targets that were set by the Air Resources Board for the various areas within California for 2020 and 2035 that must be met. And it's a responsibility of the, as I say, the Metropolitan Planning Organization to deal with it. It has three components: cleaner vehicles, cleaner fuels, and more sustainable communities. What the heck does that mean? Well, there's something called Senate Bill 375 that was passed in 2008 that says you've got to meet those the greenhouse gas requirements for passenger vehicles. The metropolitan planning ordinators have to prepare a sustainable community strategy to meet those things, and it's got to be integrated with land use, housing, and transportation planning. So kind of tells you a little bit about the theme that we talked about, the importance of linking transportation and land use. They become federally enforceable, these plans, and it also occurs in incentives. So these folks are right in the middle of dealing with this stuff. This particular slide presentation was from 2011. So these folks are struggling with what these look like. They're thinking about how to now control and encourage certain development. They're looking hard at, this happens to be the Bay Area, as you can see. They're looking at planned development areas, and they're looking at planned conservation areas. They're thinking through about the importance also of there's another reality, and that is driving in the core area is more expensive. They're trying to figure out what is the best combination of actions to somehow meet these requirements. One of the things that they've looked at, I was thinking back to Mayor Bloomberg's comment about what the cost is of putting up physical barriers to sea change. Well, if you look in the Bay Area, one hand they said it's a huge number. It's $5 billion to protect some of the Bay Area, but look at the loss potentially in disaster areas if you now have a bunch of buildings that are flooded and so on. It's well over 10 times that. So maybe it's not such a bad idea, but the question is now, where do you get the money? They're thinking about, can we just change people's attitudes, and they're thinking, well, if you can change people's cigarette consumption, maybe we can change the way people think about this topic. This is interesting. This is a very recent piece of information from January, from last month. As a result of this, the MPO talking to the community, having a lot of community meetings. Here's what they're reflecting back on. Here's what they've heard from the public. That yes, they do want to improve the economy through better access between housing and transportation. They want to support housing density. They want to support transit expansion. They want to get into land use strategies. And oh, by the way, they don't want to hear a bunch of people grousing about it. Apparently, is what the last thing was, which is kind of interesting. When people are grousing about the requirements of this Senate Bill 375, they said, look, we got to get serious about it and move on. What they're doing now is they're in the process of now weighing different options. They said certain of the low-hanging fruit things that are going to perhaps help us reduce VMT. They've got a price tag on some of the smaller things of bike plans and so on of a little under $1 billion, and that has basically 1% of their revenue. They're looking at fix-it-first strategies. This means really put more money into the local repair of their local road system, and oh, by the way, when a transit vehicle is worn out, replace it and don't try and limp along because it's going to cost you more. Excuse me. And they've estimated that kind of a strategy in the San Francisco areas costs $27 billion. Well, that means they've now spent 43% of all their resources. They've also got something called the One Bay Area Grant Framework, and this is more about incentives. They're saying, well, if we can get communities to do things related to encouraging more biking and walking and preserving open space, maybe it's worthwhile rewarding people for doing that. Maybe that's also a little bit conflicts with some of the fix-it-first strategy. So you can see they're in a process now of struggling, trying to figure out what the best way to now launch a plan and what's acceptable. Very much a part of this whole business about trying to change people's attitudes and trying to get public support for activity. Next is there's a whole discussion about focusing growth around transit. So can you do those things to encourage people to plan the development in the right places? Part of that now is where they have high performing kinds of investments, whether it's a road project or a transit project, how can I relate it to those kinds of criteria that are going to produce positive things in terms of reducing greenhouse gas and have these other elements. And again, it's another dollar choice issue that they've got to face. And finally, they've got some issues related, or some ideas on strategies to squeeze more efficiency out of the system. Bottom line is, they're now in the process of saying, all right, now, where do I want to be? Do I want to be on the left side, which is the current plan, or do I want to be on the right-hand side of this chart, where I'm spending more operating and maintenance money for transit, because I got to keep my transit going. I want to make sure I still can operate and maintain a good road system. But if I do that, it means I may have to cut down on some of the road expansion, and I may also have to cut down on transit expansion. So it's a tough place to be, but those are the kind of struggles that are going on in California, and they think if they tend more to the right side of the previous chart, they're going to be on this kind of a track. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an area that I think we're going to see much more struggling with nationwide, because California isn't alone. When you see 36% of greenhouse gas produced in Massachusetts coming from the transportation side, we all have to pay attention to it. I'll close with this chart. When you look at what percent of the world's CO2 is coming from various countries, sometimes it's not that wonderful to be first. And it's interesting to see how much per capita we're all producing in some of the more developed nations versus some of the others. There's some real interest in these numbers, and I'm convinced that with a lot of different practice, we can probably move the needle significantly and produce a much more sustainable environment. Thanks very much.